I'm really excited to have our guest today, Hannah Goldfield. So she's officially a food critic, but Hannah is also a fabulous travel writer. She manages to take her readers around the world without ever leaving New York City. Her Tables for Two column in The New Yorker is a total pleasure to read, for restaurant tips, of course, but also as a way to understand the city's constantly changing ethnic dynamic. Hannah is a fearless eater and a generous observer of the cultural landscape. I'm so happy to have her as our guest for At Lunch. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here.
So glad to have you. So Hannah, when the legendary food critic Mimi Sheraton died a couple of weeks ago at age 97, so you can eat a lot and live a long time, you'll be glad to know. I wondered if she had influenced you or if she was too far removed from your generation. So I Googled your names together and I found the loveliest tribute that you wrote about her on Twitter. So could you tell people about your relationship with Mimi Sheraton?
I would be delighted. Yeah, it was on the tribute was on Instagram, actually. I'm no longer on Twitter, though. Mimi herself was a very avid Twitter user up until about a year ago. And that was one of the ways in which I connected with her. But I first met her in, I believe it was 2009, when I was a fact checker at The New Yorker. And she was still writing for the magazine then. She wrote for many years after that, in fact, for the magazine. And she wrote this story about a German style of cake, a spit cake called Baumkuchen, I believe, that she remembered from her childhood in New York. She was born and raised in Brooklyn, but lived in the Village for many, many years and spent a lot of time in Yorkville, which used to be like, a bastion of German food. And she loved this cake, and she wrote this amazing essay about the history of the cake and where you could still get it. And so I was her fact checker, and we developed a bit of a relationship that way. And I believe I fact checked a couple of other stories for her. And then we kind of stayed in touch over email because she continued to write books. And I was an editor for a while at the New York Times Style magazine. And we discussed coverage of this book she wrote called 1,000 Things to Eat Before You Die, which is an incredible, incredible book. And then I would see her at parties occasionally, but we didn't have much of a relationship until last fall. I wrote a Tables for Two about some kind of revived, or not revived, Jewish businesses that were expanding, Jewish restaurants that were expanding, which seems unlikely in the landscape of the city today. But Kosser's Bialy's opened a second location just outside of Hudson Yards, and Pastrami Queen opened a second location on the Upper West Side. And so I wrote about that. And I quoted from her book, The Bialy Eaters, which is also an incredible book. She was just such a wonderful writer. And she wrote this book where she basically searched for the Bialy in Bialystok, where it originated. And anyway, she was so sharper than I am, truly, as the mother of two small children who doesn't get enough sleep. She was honestly more on top of it than I was. And she wrote me an email thanking me for mentioning the book. And I asked her if she wanted to get lunch sometime, and she wasn't leaving her house at the end of her life, but she's invited me over. And so we struck up this friendship where I went and brought her lunch a couple of times, and I was supposed to see her this past week. And then while it was just before Passover, I guess we emailed about Passover cooking. And then the next thing I knew, I was getting a notification on the New York Times that she had passed. I knew she wasn't well. She had been in the hospital and then in rehab, but she seemed to be recovering. And then, she was 97. So anyway, that was, I feel so lucky to have had that relationship with her at the end of her life. She really did feel like a friend. She was so much fun to talk to, such an inspiration for me. I'm finding her to be an inspiration now more than ever. I had a bunch of her books, but I ordered all the rest of them, used copies. A lot of them are out of print online. And I'm just thinking about her legacy a lot and how it could guide my career. So.
Oh my God, it's so beautiful. And I feel like really it is, since we are in a Jewish environment here,
Yeah.
it is Lador Vador. It's from generation to generation.
Yeah.
It's really, I'm sure she's smiling somewhere up there
I
to
think
know
so.
this, you know, because you
hope
are
so.
a great carrier honor of her legacy. I really do
I
believe
hope
that.
so.
So it's wonderful. So did you grow up in a food obsessed household? I mean, it's not necessarily a normal thing, or maybe it is now, but I don't know if it was even 30 years ago to be a little kid and say, or 20 years ago to be a little kid and say, oh, I want to be a food critic. So when did you decide that?
So yes, I did grow up in a food obsessed household, and was obsessed with food from a very young age. And yeah, it's true that it wasn't necessarily common for kids in that era. You know, I was born in the mid 80s, to want to be a food critic, and especially for a woman. But just to tie it back to Mimi Sheraton, she was the first woman to be the food critic at the New York Times. And there were several men in between her and Ruth Reichel, who was the food critic at the times when I was sort of coming of age. So I thought it was just a normal job for for anyone to have, and especially for a woman. I didn't understand that was unusual. But yeah, so I grew up in my father, it's funny, my parents have very different relationships to food. My father is food obsessed. My mother kind of could eat the same thing for every meal. I think she appreciates good food, but it's just not in her DNA to really, really care about it. Whereas my father is similarly obsessed. And he's a really passionate and adventurous cook. So I grew up eating food from around the world, cooked at home. He had all of these cookbooks and loved to shop at, specialty markets. And I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, which is a pretty diverse city in a number of ways, but I think that a lot of it has to do, a lot of the kind of food diversity has to do with Yale, because it's, a university that attracts students from all around the world. And so there were all these markets that were there to kind of serve them. And I went to a cooperative daycare where the parents took turns making the food for the kids. And a lot of the parents were Yale grad students from all over the world. So I think I don't have the clearest memories of what we ate, but I know that we ate food from all around the world. I remember eating things like couscous, which I think was not necessarily a common, dish in the American households, broadly speaking. But I think we also had a lot of potlucks. I think that was an early introduction to this kind of breadth of food. And yeah, I was always thinking about my next meal from a young age. And then when I was 10, I've told this story a lot, and I'm sure that it's somewhat apocryphal and I'm forgetting details, but when I was 10, this movie came out called My Best Friend's Wedding, which is like a pretty silly rom-com starring Julia Roberts. And not a big plot point, a plot point that sort of fans out in the first 5 minutes of the movie is that Julia Roberts is a restaurant critic. And there's this very dramatic, the opening scene, I believe, is this dramatic scenario where she's at a restaurant and everyone at the restaurant knows that she's there and that she's reviewing the restaurant. So they're all like, peering through the galley window of the kitchen and hanging on to her every move and word. And she declares what she thinks of the restaurant out loud. It's just like, I now know it's a preposterous situation. It's not how it works, but I was just blown away by this. I didn't know that it was a job at that point. And it seemed so wonderful and so glamorous, and to, stitch together all of my interests, because I knew already at the age of 10 that I wanted to write. And so from then on, I would, when someone asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would say restaurant critic. And as I said, Ruth Rachel was the critic at the time. So my dad encouraged me to start reading her reviews, which I did. They used to run in a section called Dining In, Dining Out. And we got the paper and every Wednesday, and I would be excited to read it. And yeah, that was the beginning of my ambition for restaurant criticism. And I don't think that I thought I would actually do it. But here I am.
Yeah, it's a fairy tale, right? Julia Roberts' next movie.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny going back to those potlucks. I mean, you did write somewhere that once your dad brought kasha varnishkas to school for a third grade potluck. I remember those very well to represent your family heritage. And I was wondering how much of a role being Jewish has played in your life, both culinarily, obviously, but also just as a person.
Yeah, I think it's been huge. So my dad is Jewish. My mom is actually not Jewish, which I think I've always thought, I mean, this is, stereotypes, but it counts for their different relationships with food to at least some degree, at least in the context of our family. So I grew up having this feeling that Jews were obsessed with food and we were constantly eating, and we were eating, it was just all the cliches of my grandmother in particular was always asking if you'd eaten, always plying me with more food, which I loved, would make way too much food for every family gathering. There were always leftovers. And then on my mom's side, I adore my grandmother, who's still alive. She herself says that she can't cook. She said to me recently, if I can't broil it, I'm not cooking it. And she was a very mid-century, didn't, light on the salt, light on the seasoning in general, kind of Betty Crocker, mix it and dump it, and has her little repertoire of dishes. And I get a certain comfort from her cooking, but it was always, the joke is always that there wasn't ever enough of it. It was like there was an allotment of 2 asparagus spears per person, whereas my Jewish grandmother was pulling out, just casserole after casserole of lemon chicken and brisket and roasted vegetables, and we'd have 4 pies at every meal. So in that sense, I drew these lines around culture and food. And then the kasha varnishkas thing was really, I think, formative for me. I still to this day love that dish so much, and it's really polarizing. My husband, who's both of his parents are Jewish, does not particularly like it. And a lot of people, I think people think barley is, buckwheat is not that appealing, and it's a funny brown dish, but I think it's so delicious and so comforting. And I remember just an early sense of pride about having this dish that represented our heritage, and my dad loved it and I loved it. And I just thought it was very thrilling to have this connection to that dish. And then, I spent a lot, we lived much closer to my dad's parents. So I spent a lot of time with my paternal grandparents. And my grandmother, as I said, was just constantly feeding me. So I feel like that was really, really formative.
Amazing. I love that story. Great. So at age 10, you decided to become somebody just popped up a comment. Kasha varnishkas is my childhood fave, and adult fave too. You've got kasha varnishkas fans out there. So Ken, you decided to follow Julia Roberts' fictional footsteps.
Right.
And then I noticed that everything you've done since then seems to have begun with an F. You wrote about fashion, you were a fact checker. And then, so tell me I think people how did you get from there to here in terms of career-wise?
So I wrote my first, restaurant review when I was 15. And actually it was, speaking of the Jewish aspect of my life. And I should say I grew up we belonged to a conservative temple. I went to Hebrew school twice a week. I went to synagogue every Saturday. I always joke that we were sort of born again Jews, because my dad, who had been raised Jewish, but ate They served lobster at his bar mitzvah, and then he kind of abandoned it. And then when my sister, I think my sister is on this chat, in fact, or on the event. When we, yeah, there she is. When I was about 10, I think my dad decided I went to some Hebrew schools before that. And then my dad decided that he wanted to become part of a Jewish community. And so we joined this conservative temple that was in walking distance from our house. And my sister and I had a mikvah because we technically needed to convert since our mother is not Jewish. So we had a mikvah and then began our Jewish education as kids. And anyway, so when I was 15, I was an intern at an alternative weekly newspaper called the New Haven Advocate, which sadly doesn't exist anymore. And they knew I was interested in food, and they assigned me a restaurant review, and I reviewed a place called the Westville Kosher Meat Market, which was a grocery store, but they had prepared foods that you could eat in. It was, counter service, but you could eat, they would warm them up for you, or you could bring them home. And so I took my dad and my best friend, and we went and ate, and I wrote a restaurant review in which I made fun of my mother, I remember, for not being able to cook. And so that was my first foray. And then that was in high school. And then I went to college. I went to Columbia, and I remember realizing that other people wanted to write about food. And it suddenly, I think I was so intimidated by the competition, because it had always been my thing, and then I felt like, well, I have to find something else to do because the field is too crowded. And so I kind of backed away from it. But I was still interested in journalism, and I ended up getting a job right out of college as a fact checker at the New Yorker. And I loved that. I loved being a fact checker so much. And I started to, occasionally I would fact check Tables for Two, which at the time was a column that was shared by people who were already on staff at the magazine. It wasn't its own thing. It didn't have its own page. It was in the Goings On About Town section, but it was like a little sidebar. And so it was, as I say, it was shared by a roster of people. At some point, a year or two into my time at as a fact checker at the magazine, one of those people left. And so a slot opened up, and I think I had made it known that I was interested in food. And the editor asked me if I wanted to try writing one. And this is, again, the Jewish thing comes up again. The first Tables for Two I wrote was about a deli called Mile End, which is in Brooklyn and Cobble Hill, but modeled after the delis of Montreal. And it was the perfect restaurant for me to write about, because I have spent a lot of time in Montreal. My aforementioned sister is a graduate of McGill. It was a big thing for our family. We loved eating at all of the Jewish restaurants that this restaurant was sort of an homage to. So I had a great time writing about that place, and they decided that it was good enough that I could have the slot. And so I started, writing once every 6 weeks or so. And then I kind of timed out of being a fact checker. It's a great job, but it's, I felt I couldn't do it forever. I kind of burnt out on it. It's really intense. And I ended up leaving the magazine to try editing, which I did at the New York Times style magazine. And then after that, I decided I wanted to write again. So I went freelance. And while I was freelancing, I did some writing for the New Yorker. And then they decided that they wanted to hire a designated food writer. And they ended up hiring two of us, Helen Rosner and I. And I had done Tables for Two already. So I was kind of a natural fit to take on the column. And they made it a little bit more prominent, gave it its own page over time. And that's how I landed here.
Wow, that's great. Well, I would argue it wasn't just because you'd done it before, but you happened to do it extremely well. So it's really funny that you're talking about all this Jewish food, because when I think of your Tables for Two, I mostly think of trays. I mean,
yeah.
So I have to tell you that we have these very good friends who live in rural Maine, and my friend Jen Odlifson, who is a physician's assistant there, is obsessed with your column. And when she
Oh.
heard you were going to be a guest today, she was just flipped out. So I asked her if she had anything special she wanted to ask you. So I'm going to read you her question.
Oh, great. I love it.
So it's, what does Hannah decline to eat? She writes about the pleasures of, quote, slippery little boiled quail eggs and pork tripe, and, quote, slabs of congealed duck blood, exclamation point, exclamation point. Ghastly. Does anything draw the limit? So my question to you, is there anything that you see on a menu that you just think, I can't do it?
I think my answer to that is no. I don't think there's anything that I wouldn't try. There are definitely things that I do not enjoy and don't want to eat, but I think I just, when it comes to food, I'm pretty fearless about trying things, and my curiosity is overwhelming. It overwhelms any fear. I'm one of those people who, if you say, do you want to smell something disgusting? I always say yes, like it's just, I don't know. I just have this kind of draw to the most extreme experiences when it comes to eating. I'm a pretty timid person, I'm not like athletic or adventurous physically, except when it comes to food. So I don't think there's anything that I wouldn't try. I mean, I think always of, I think the most famously like extreme thing that Anthony Bourdain tried was I think it was a pig anus or something he was with a tribe, and I think it wasn't even cooked. And that's like, I wouldn't do that. That to me, I mean, I respect that someone eats it, but I just think that I couldn't get over so maybe that's my answer. If someone offered me uncooked pig offal, I would probably say no.
Well, just following up on it, because there is something incredible about the idea of all these strange things that you eat. Can you remember something that you saw on the menu and that gave you pause, but you thought, no, this is my job. I have to forge ahead. And then what was your reaction to that? And I guess the follow-up to that is, if it's something that's so, I don't want to say repulsive, but maybe scary to you as something to eat, how do you feel about evaluating it?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, what are some examples? There's a Filipino dish called balut that is a fertilized egg that is not the first thing I jump at to eat. It's like you're eating basically an embryo of a bird. Now I'm blanking on what bird. It's a duck. I think it's a duck. I think it can be a duck or a goose. I think it's most commonly a duck. I could be wrong about that. Someone should fact check me. But it's like, the yolk gets really hard and chalky. And then it's like this, talk about slippery, this sort of slippery, it doesn't, I mean, but in the Philippines, kids eat it as like an after school snack. So that's how I try to evaluate it. I try to do my research and contextualize it. And I try to be really open-minded about food, because, everyone has everyone brings their own biases to things. And what's delicious to someone is repulsive to someone else. And so I try to take it out of my own evaluation in terms of whether or not I like it, and try to just present it with full context.
Great. So somebody just put a question in the chat and you say, I absolutely love your column. I've noticed that you've broadened the definition of what can be reviewed as a restaurant since COVID forced you to reimagine the column. How have you thought about the new definition of a restaurant review since?
Yeah, I feel like for me, it's kind of always evolving, which is sort of nice because it keeps me on my toes a little bit. But yeah, I mean, everything, all the rules got kind of thrown out of the window during COVID. And I feel like the restaurant industry is sort of coming, if it's not fully what it was before, it's on its way, or at least it's resembling the pre-COVID scene, pretty closely. But COVID was was terrible in so many ways, or that, I should say it's always going to be with us, I think. But the first sort of 2 years when it was really determining life, it was terrible. But for me, creatively, it was pretty inspiring because people were getting really creative, and it was really fun to watch restaurateurs and chefs figure out how to adapt to this new situation. And yes, I, especially in 2020 and 2021, I wrote about all kinds of, sort of enterprises that weren't necessarily restaurants in the traditional sense, but were businesses devised to get people delicious and exciting food. And I love that. And right now I'm not doing so much of that. There isn't as much of it happening. I think I still would if something really interesting popped up, literally pop-ups, but mostly I've gone back to covering, brick and mortar restaurants because there are so many of them opening. So I think I'm just going to sort of follow the waves of the industry. So that's my plan.
Well, it's interesting because I feel obviously you're a critic and you're a very good critic, but I think why people, or at least why this person is so engaged by your column is that it's really goes way beyond just, it's really good criticism. You're really looking at the restaurant and the food in a larger context. And it's almost like a sociological essay about things. And maybe, is that your?
Yes, that's definitely what I'm going for. I like to think of it as more than anything else as a kind of snapshot of the city and a way to sort of chronicle culture, and specifically New York City culture. So yes, I think, yes, I am a critic, but I'm not necessarily, it's not just about telling you if I think it's good or not. It's about telling a story, painting a picture of what it's like to be in New York right now, and what it's like to eat at restaurants. But eating at restaurants is such a big part of life in New York that I think it's very representative of the city at large.
Yeah, and so somebody asked about this in the chat, and I was also, I mean, it's the, I guess, obvious question, but it's an important obvious question, which is there are so many restaurants, and what also great about your column is you don't just go to the high priests of food, you go to everybody. And so how in the world do you pick what to eat? Do you go out every night and then, or 10 times a day and try different things? Or so that's part of it. How did it change? Obviously COVID, but now we're getting back to it. And then you had a baby, 2 babies, what?
2 babies, yeah.
2 babies. So that probably changed your pattern, I would imagine, as well, unless you're having them eat duck tripe or whatever.
Yeah. I used to think that it used to be that the writing was the hardest part of the job, because when I was in my 20s, it was easy to just run around all the time and go to restaurants, and I had no responsibilities, and I also wasn't doing it every week when I was in my 20s. But now those things are the hardest parts of the job. The writing, I've done it for so long, it's still hard. I still find writing to be pretty agonizing, but it actually is less difficult than deciding where to write about and then pounding the pavement trying to find trying the places out. So it's really, and it's also hard because I'm not just writing about the most obvious buzzy places. I'm trying to cast the widest net possible. I'm trying to write about restaurants in all 5 boroughs, which is really hard. And I think I could be doing a better job of that. I have not been to the Bronx in many months. Queens is easy. There's so many restaurants in Queens, and then Manhattan and Brooklyn are just the obvious, epicenter of restaurants. And then Staten Island, I'm really, really trying to cover Staten Island, but it's slower there in terms of openings. But yeah, so what do? I read pretty exhaustively what I think of as the trades, which are, The Infatuation, Eater, Grub Street. That New York Magazine is such an amazing magazine. But they catalog every opening basically, or they try to. And so I try to just stay on top of that, and I keep lists of what seems interesting. I use Instagram a lot, and I'm trying to get into TikTok. I'm like slightly too old for TikTok. It's not like I'm not a TikTok native. Instagram is easy for me. But TikTok is like a foreign land. But that's also like finding people who are restaurant obsessed and sort of watching them and figuring out where they're going and places that people are talking about. And then, I try a lot more restaurants than I end up writing about. So I don't go to 10 restaurants a day, but I try to go to, I was going to say I try to go to one a day. I don't succeed at that, but I try to eat out. I'd say I go out every Saturday night, and then I try to go out 2 or 3 nights a week in addition to that. And then I do a lot of lunches as well. But it's really challenging as the mother of 2 little kids. It's important to me to have dinner with them, or at least to be there while they're eating dinner. So it's a real calculation and, just a constant juggling of babysitters and coordinating with my husband and figuring it all out. So on the weekends, I try to bring them with me sometimes, which is a double-edged kind of thing, because, sometimes they're really into it and sometimes they're both screaming. But yeah, it's chaotic, but also fun. It's just the most fun job in the world. It is a job. It's hard. But it's a lot of fun.
Well, I have to say that sense of fun, you're getting a lot of fan mail here in the chat. People
so nice.
Love what you do. And so I was thinking back to your description of Julia Roberts and them watching from the thing and her pronouncing whatever. Obviously, you're not doing that, but you have gotten some pushback from at least one restaurant, which when I was Googling around with the whole Odeon.
Oh God,
which you've got to tell people about, because when I read it, I was actually, I love Odeon. It just was one of the first of that type restaurants down there. And I thought they were pretty, I don't know, sore heads. I hope nobody from the Odeon is in it, but tell people about that story, because it was so terrible.
It really makes me laugh. I'll preface it by saying that I think that I wrote about the Odeon at a very tender time for restaurateurs. I think that was 2020, right? I think it was fall.
Yeah, right at the beginning.
I think everyone was on their back foot and people were sensitive, and clearly the owner of the Odeon was sensitive, because I went and ate at the Odeon's outdoor setup, and I wrote a kind of a little bit snarky, but I thought very loving story about, or column about the Odeon. I love the Odeon. I really do. I don't think that the food is particularly good, but it's fine. They do what they do pretty well. And it's like, it's all atmosphere, and the atmosphere is unbeatable. It's just like, it's an iconic restaurant that I would go to any day. And I always see people I know there, and it's just so much fun. But I took, I felt it was an opportunity to make some jokes, and I joked about how, a lot of celebrities go to the Odeon. There's a real like VIP scene there. And I was observing that they had kind of replicated the idea of restaurant Siberia, meaning like the tables that aren't as primo. They had managed to do that outside, because they had seating that wrapped around, and like, they put all the important people in the front, and then the Joe Schmoes were around the side by this kind of back door. But then I got a little imaginative and was suggesting that the back door was where the line cooks would go to smoke cigarettes on their breaks, and that it was where the vegetables, or the ingredients were loaded in and out of the kitchen. And that turned out not to be true. And that was what, I'm going to butcher her name, Lynn Waganacht, I think is how you pronounce it. She took issue with that. And I mean, fair enough. The New Yorker is known for fact checking, as I've, as a fact checker myself, I should have known not to get carried away, but it was 2020. It was a difficult time for me too. And we ended up running a correction, but she wrote a letter to the magazine, And then she also wrote a letter in the Tribeca Star, which is like the local
That's what I read.
paper. I thought it was pretty funny. Like, it's like, I sort of felt like, oh my God, am I persona non grata there now? I imagine she's gotten over it. And it wasn't like what I told you, that's all I did, you know, and I think I said that the food wasn't, you know, amazing, but I'm sure she's heard that before. And then also she took issue with the fact that, that in the photo, the photographer brought like some hand sanitizer and it was included in the photo, and I guess I don't know. It got a little.
Yeah, it was, I guess to me, it was interesting because honestly, I've read snarky reviews in the world of snark. It was hardly very snarky.
Yeah,
It was pretty
I would agree with
affectionate.
that.
And it was a little disappointing to me, but you're right. It was COVID. Everybody has to be.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I've forgiven and forgotten, and I hope she has too.
Me too. So we have an interesting question from somebody here, back to Jewish.
Okay.
Apparently, Mimi Sheraton and Ruth Reichel also had Jewish parents and spent formative years in New York City. Is there anything else you'd like to add to these as possible common denominators? Do you think that not, quote, keeping kosher was an example of your adventurousness, rebelliousness, transgressive natures that made you all better food critics?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, just practically speaking, the fact that none of us grew up in kosher households means that we ate everything. So I do think that I think that if we'd grown up in kosher households, I think that doesn't mean that we wouldn't have all gone on to write about food. But yes, interestingly, my dad, once, I forget, it was like a few years into this kind of Jewish reawakening, that he stopped eating treif and still doesn't eat it. So, but it was too late for me, because as I said, we grew up in New Haven, and two of the things that sort of defined, and sorry, I'm like, this is like treif porn, but we ate these incredible Italian pork sausages because New Haven's very Italian. And then we also would get these pork buns from the Chinese grocery. And though I was a goner, you know, it was like, I loved, those were some of my favorite things to eat. And then my dad suddenly was like, we're not going to have those in the house anymore. and I was like, okay, well, I'll have to eat them somewhere else, you know? So, so I definitely continued eating them, but yeah, I do think that kind of, all the words that this person used, adventurousness, rebelliousness, and curiosity, I think that that was a common denominator. And yeah, I know that Mimi Sheraton's mother was a really good and passionate cook. Funnily enough, Ruth Reichel's mother was like a terrible cook. She, if anyone has not read her memoirs, you're missing out. But in the first one, especially, which is called Tender at the Bone, is about her early childhood, and her mother just made like atrocious things. So I think for her, it was sort of a reaction. Whereas I think Mimi and I both had one parent who, you know, cooked wonderfully, and that was the origin for us.
Great, thank you. So somebody else has asked, so what do you think you'd be doing if you weren't a writer? Did you have some alternate career backup?
I don't know. I think about this all the time, because I became a writer because I got so much validation as a really little kid, which is funny to me. It's like, I was so susceptible to praise. I was talking about this. I recorded a podcast the other day, and I was talking about this. I wrote a poem in a haiku in, I think, first grade, and it was my parents made a huge deal of it, and the teacher made a huge deal of it. And I think I decided, well, if I can get, you know, validation like this, then I have to be a writer. Whereas looking back, I'm like, it's an agonizing job in some ways. Being a writer is really hard. I dabbled with the idea of being a scientist. It's hard to imagine myself actually doing that, but I did. In high school, I interned at a genetics lab. I was really into biology for a while. And then in college, I actually majored in biological anthropology. And so I took a lot of classes about apes. And I don't think I ever really considered going into that field, but I did really enjoy learning about apes and early humans. And I took a class in forensic osteology where I learned how to study bones and human bones and animal bones and understand things about them. So maybe I would have been a scientist, but I think this was sort of predetermined that I would be.
Well, and also those things sound somewhat related to what you do, sort of anthropology, bones. I'm sure you've eaten bones too in terms.
Yes.
So the question that's come up a couple of times is maybe an obvious one, but those are sometimes what people want to know, which is, do you take people out with you, and how do you choose them? How do you get to be Hannah's date for a food?
Yes,
adventure?
I always take people with me. Occasionally I'll go by myself if it's like a prefix or something, and it's like we would all be eating the same thing anyway, but just in order to order the volume of food necessary to really assess a place, I always bring at least one other person. It used to be my husband, and other. If it was only one person, it would be him. And now he stays home with our kids most of the time. Although we get to go, we have our standing Saturday night and we get a babysitter, and he came with me just this past Tuesday. We made an exception. And then otherwise, just friends. It's a great way to make friends, easiest, fastest way to make friends. There are people who I kind of admire, and I'll end up inviting them out. But I also have a sort of short list of friends who I know are the perfect companions for this, because you really there's a right way and a wrong way to be a restaurant critic's guest. You have to be willing to pay attention to the food. And some people, I've learned the hard way, want to talk about other things, but I have to, and you have to be patient, and you have to be willing to eat everything. I can't really bring you if you're a picky eater, because then it's just like, what are we doing here? So I have this short list of friends who I know totally get it and are just kind of the right personalities.
Are you taking notes while you're eating, or?
I do. I take quick photos. It's helpful actually to live in the phone. I mean, I hate the fact that everyone is constantly on their phones, but it is helpful because everyone's on their phones. Nobody really notices when I'm taking notes. I do, like, people just think I'm texting, I think, although I'm sure I've been marked some of the time, but I take notes, which are sometimes useful. And sometimes I go back and I'm like, how did I think this was gonna help me? It's like, I've written down absolute gibberish. And then I take quick photos, not photos that would work on Instagram or anything, or for the review itself, but just to remember what I ate. So yes, notes are more and more. I'm finding I need to take notes to remember things.
Hannah, we're almost at the end of our time. This is so delightful. I know people could listen to you for a very long time, but before we go, I was wondering myself, have you thought about following in the footsteps of Mimi Sheraton and Ruth Reichel in another way, and writing a book of some kind related to food or criticism or any of that?
I have thought about it. I have a book agent who is wonderful. We've been talking about various ideas. I haven't landed on the right thing yet, but yeah, I would love to. I would love to do it if I could find the right thing. I'm feeling, as I said, very inspired by Mimi, and looking at the breadth of books that she wrote over the years, and it's helping me expand my mind a little bit about what a food book can be and what I could or couldn't write. So yes, I would really like to do that eventually, but I
think you have a lot of fans here who would like you to do it as well. But before we go, I have one more good one from
sure.
the audience. Picky eaters, you mentioned. So have vegans, gluten-free, other picky eaters affected your reuves?
Meaning, do I try to write for them?
Not sure. It says he didn't elaborate.
Yeah.
Ruben Weiner.
I mean, I do. I try.
I mean, do you take that into consideration at all, or do you?
Yes, I think I especially the vegan thing. I try. I try if there's. I'll try to highlight the fact that a dish is vegan or gluten-free, especially if it's really wonderful. And I definitely think about that. I think, like, if I eat something and I love it and I realize it's gluten-free, I'll definitely mention that, because it feels like a lifeline for people who are, restricted in their eating in some way. I feel like it's a nice gift to give people. And then, the idea of eating less meat and not as many animal products. I find that compelling as a person who cares about the environment. And so I think I could be doing it. There's still so much meat that's available, and I love meat. But I'm always thinking about how I can write about more, more about food that's not so meat centric. I think
Okay,
I
now
could
just
do
two
better.
quickies before we have to leave.
Yeah.
Somebody wrote and asked, do you ever go above 57th Street?
I do. And this is like yes. And people, I get that a lot. I do. It's just a fact that there isn't as much going on restaurant wise uptown as downtown, but I'm always looking for places. So if you person who lives above 57th Street have any ideas of places that you're excited about, please let me know. Because I do, as I said, I'm trying really hard to cover the whole city. But it's hard. I'm one person and I have limited time, but yes, I do go. I love uptown, so I'll continue to try.
Okay, then one final question from
Yes.
somebody to round out the Jewish theme of the day. How do you feel about chopped liver?
Love it. I love it. I just think it's delicious. I came to it kind of late in life. I remember thinking it was sort of icky as a kid, but now I love it. Although one thing that I absolutely despise, actually thinking back to your friend's question, is I do not like calves liver. Chicken liver all day long, and calves liver, at least I'm sure that's the other thing about foods I like or don't like. It all depends on preparation. I'm sure someone could make an incredible calves liver, but I ate calves liver at Joe Allen a few years ago. And I love that restaurant. It's a classic of the theater district. They have a great burger and martini, but I ordered the calves liver to try to kind of get the whole feel of it. And I just it haunted me. For no offense to the restaurant. I think it was prepared fine, but it just was not my thing. But chopped liver, yes.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Hannah. This was delightful.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.